Hello everybody, and welcome to a more personal video about my thoughts on inflation today. And this is kind of, me thinking out loud and sharing everything I've learned about inflation over many years now. And so, tomorrow is CPI. Everybody's talking about CPI. Everybody's afraid about, 0.5% or 0.2%. What if CPI comes in hot, the market is going to crash? This is just irrelevant short-termism. I believe the CPI is irrelevant for most people unless there is a person that perfectly fits the spending pattern of a CPI. And I believe in the original definition of inflation, which is monetary inflation. Even Jay Powell in front of Congress, noted that, inflation is primarily a monetary phenomenon. But today we promote it as CPI, and we call it two different things. Well, it's not two different things. One of my, most admired scientists that I really like is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is not very popular anymore these days. Mostly because history has made him look like this anti-business, this anti-people person or pro-capitalist person, too pro-business. But the truth is, Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner, had understood quite a few things right, in my view. And one of the things that he understood the most right was inflation and monetary printing. His contributions in this field were, to me, foundational. And if you're interested in Milton Friedman and want to understand how this works, I really recommend Free to Choose, which is a book from the 70s, and then he did a series based on that book that was going on PBS, in the US, and some of the most entertaining, thoughtful series out there, in my view. If you can withstand old shows, I really recommend looking at that. I love Milton Friedman, and much of what I think of inflation comes from libertarian economics, not Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics are wrong, in my opinion. I believe in the Austrian school of thought, and I believe we've seen over and over again in the history of the world that really it's not, the economy doesn't follow Keynesian principles of, printing more money to relaunch the economy. That is not how over the long run it has worked. This is the short-term era that we're in, this Keynesian phase, and I believe it's coming to an end. Which is kind of why I've made a few videos on Bitcoin, but nobody cares about Bitcoin because I talk mostly about stocks, right? And I'm still more comfortable with stocks than Bitcoin, but Bitcoin has some very interesting principles. So let me go ahead and talk about inflation. So it used to be a few years back that monetary inflation was no different from monetary printing, right? We would call inflation monetary inflation. And that was up until the late 90s. Inflation and monetary inflation were the same thing. So let's go back to basic economics. Imagine a world with no change in money supply, which is still a major assumption of most thinkers and economic models. Imagine this world. In a world with a fixed money supply, the only force driving prices up would be the supply of goods divided, right, or crossing the demand. And the demand, right, people giving up time for money in the form of labor, right? So the demand is embodied by dollars. So people demand goods by giving dollars for them. You give dollars against the goods that you want. So the equilibrium between supply and demand, which dictates price, is meeting how many dollars are people willing to put on goods. Very important to remember that, right? And so you have two things, right, in whether prices should go up and down. You have demand factors, right? How many people want to give up dollars? This is very important. How many people want to give up dollars for a product, right? If you take a walk and you walk past a restaurant and you find a $20 bill on the ground and you pick it up, you're more likely to spend that bill because you just got that money out of nowhere. So this increases demand. The money supply, how much money is out there, increases demand. If money is really rare and it's hard to get by, then there's going to be less demand. And then it's the supply of goods. But imagine a world where the number of dollars out there are fixed. If the number of dollars were fixed, the only thing that would matter would be the supply of goods. And if you look at the supply of goods, there's two things, right? There's laws and edicts and regulation that make things harder to make, harder to produce. This tends to have, I would argue, a minimal impact on supply dynamics. But i.e. a reduction, but a minimal reduction. But I would argue it doesn't come even close to the most important factors, which is, as a society, we have insane productivity gains. And our productivity gains increase the supply of goods, almost regardless of how much regulation there is out there. Businesses are, entrepreneurial, and they find ways to produce more goods with the same amount of resources and energy. That's a classic of business, of Austrian economics. Over time, productivity increase supply. And we've seen this throughout the history of humanity. Automation gains and learning gains, right? As you learn how to do something and as you learn how to automate, everything becomes cheaper. Agriculture, industry, even mining techniques, right? An example of mining techniques is we get ever more oil out of the ground. We keep finding oil. We have fracking and all these techs. Agriculture, we have more yield than ever. I was reading an article that, something like 30% of our agricultural land is not being used anymore because we're so productive, right? Industry, we have huge scale in our factories. So businesses, when businesses does its job, it increases supply of goods. That's not rent seeking. That's a good way of doing business. That's the capitalistic way of doing business. You produce more goods. Okay, and consumer goods, at a fundamental level, and this will be important when we talk about inflation. Consumer goods, they get easier to make over time, always. Thus increasing, even a home, even building a home, which is just a big consumer product. If you look at it as an economist, even that gets cheaper over time with building techniques and better tools, better tooling, etc. We get better at making stuff every year. So if the fixed share of dollar was the same, and we get better at making stuff every year, which we do as a species, prices should go down. So at a fundamental level, we are a deflationary species. We get better at everything we do every year, right? There's billions of us working towards creating more stuff, more ideas, more of everything for our countries, regions, and families. It's the human nature to grow. It is coded in our DNA. No difference than, say, ants or any species. We are programmed to grow. And billions of humans work towards growing, right? That's why there's 8 billion people today out there. And maybe after that 10 and 12 and 15. We are designed to grow. So if we're designed to grow and we're designed to create more stuff and more of everything we have, and the money supply is fixed, then we are a deflationary species because we get much more stuff with the same amount of money supply. And look at this over time. It has always been the case. Costs over time. The cost of hunting with a spear versus hunting by hand. And this is a cost that can only be calculated by, the number of lives saved or the number of times saved, because if it was in a pre-money era. But right, hunting with a spear is probably 1,000 times better than hunting by hand. Probably, I would argue. So that's a 3 order of magnitude better. But that's not it. Let's keep going. Let's look at history of humanity. Printing a book versus paying a monk for 3 years or 1 year or 2 years, depending on the size of a book. How much time better is it than of printing a book versus paying someone to copy the book? It's probably another 1,000 times improvement. Look at what happened in agriculture. In America, most Americans were working in agriculture up until the Civil War. And then the Industrial Revolution came around, and everybody was working in industry. We've displaced an entire generation from working on the farm to working in factories, thanks to agricultural machinery, right? How much better is a tractor compared to human hands? And it's hundreds of times better. When we built libraries were amazing. But think about libraries. How much better was the internet compared to libraries? Right? I would argue perhaps 100, perhaps 1,000x better. And then today we have AI, robotics, mega factories. I could go on about all of the revolutions that we have today. But we produce so much more at scale, which is much better than when we had 1.0 industry right back at the turn of the 20th century. So we're better at building and at making stuff all the time. Every year we get better at it. So the supply the supply of goods goes up over time because we get better at making stuff. And if we assume that the demand, as translated by the number of dollars out there, if we assume that the demand is the same, there's a fixed share of dollars, what happens is prices go down over time. Prices should always go down over time. That's what should happen. But here's the thing. Do we have fixed demand? Do we have a fixed share of dollars out there? And if you've guessed, I've named the channel Beat the Denominator because the denominator right here, this is the whole reason for the channel, the share of dollars, the denominator, what we divide everything by, right? We divide everything by dollars. That, there is no fixed supply of it. We're growing it all the time. And to illustrate this, let me just ask a question. So, how can the U.S. government have a $1 trillion deficit, and it's going to be more in 2023 because there's going to be a bunch of issues with less taxes, capital gains, no capital gains this year, not a lot. Anyways, $1 trillion deficit. Where do those dollars come from, right? And by the way, those dollars, when there's a deficit, the government spends that money, right? Issues bonds, issues treasuries. That's why they're called treasuries. Government bonds are called treasuries because they're issued by the Department of Treasury. They issue those treasuries, that debt, to pay that money, but those dollars are released in the stock of all money on earth. Just like every single loan. Every time you have a loan, you have a release of dollars into money stock, right? How can most credit-worthy households borrow $300,000 to buy their home? You know, there's not one household with $300,000 saved up for every household who wants to spend $300,000 on a house. In fact, Americans have very little savings. I think the statistics are less than $1,000 or something like that, right? How can not so credit-worthy companies borrow billions of dollars, right? How can GM or Ford still borrow money? But I could go on. There's about 40% of the companies in the S&P 500 who are able to borrow money, which in my opinion really shouldn't. How can student loans be a thing? Imagine how risky that is, right? How can you make a bet of like lending $150,000 for, you know, certain studies, right? How can they be a thing, right? How can even tiny companies issue $50,000 personal loan left and right for things like destination weddings, jacuzzis, you know, cars that are unreasonable? How can this happen? Where does this money come from? This money does not come from savers. It used to a long time ago, like 500 years ago with the Medici in Italy, but even then that quickly went away, and we quickly went to an underwriting standards where, you know, you had bills corresponding to hard money, and you could print the bills and just lie about how many bills there are compared to how much hard money there is at the bank. That's how it all started. So, how does that work? Well, we can do all of these things. We can lend all of this money because money is fiat. Money is fiat means it's based on trust. It's trust that the debt will be repaid. And banks, if they see a client that they trust will repay, because they have a job, because they're stable, because they have a good credit score, they will just lend money. And so how is money created? Money is simply created on a ledger. In fact, famously, in late 2020, on 60 Minutes, Chair Powell said, "Oh, we just print it. We print it digitally on a ledger." That's it. Money is created on a ledger. So commercial banks create the bulk of the money. It's not just the Fed. It's actually first and foremost commercial banks who create money. All they have to do is, do you have a trustworthy client somewhere or a trustworthy company? Or say a credit rating agency gives a AAA rating to a company that really shouldn't be a AAA, right? That should ring a bell if you talk about 2008. That was just credit agencies giving wrong credit ratings. Well, what do you do as a bank? You write money on the account. You input it on a ledger. You write 1000000, enter, you created the money. That's printing, right? And then the money appears on the account of a person who borrowed it. So you've created new money supply. And as the money is repaid, the principal is destroyed. So you destroy the principal. And the bank keeps interest as profit. And that is how it works. You print money first, and then you destroy the principal, and then you keep the interest at profit, and that interest comes from the economy itself. So that's the very main way that money is created. And recently, and this has been especially popular over the past 15 years, since the bailout of the auto industry in 2008 and the banks, base money is a thing now. So now, not only do you have commercial banks who all have an account at the Fed who create money, but now you have base money too. So you have the Fed directly printing money to support the economy. And one of the main things that they do is they buy government bonds issued by the Treasury. The Department of the Treasury issues federal government bonds, T-bills, and those bonds are heavily bought by the Fed, and the Fed also buys a lot of mortgage debt, and they buy more and more of assets of all sorts, and when the Fed prints money to buy those assets, right, they simply, the money that is created simply goes into the economy and grows the money stock. So if debt was always repaid, we could theoretically have a fixed money supply. But the problem is that there is always a need for more debt. People always want more debt. Companies always want more debt. It's just people want more debt. This is just something that we found out over centuries. Is that countries will always see a use for more money, people will always see a use for more money, and companies will always see a use for more money. We've seen that for centuries. And what they do is they often get more debt to pay the old debts. So the money stock itself, because we never take a breather, because we never decide as a species, we're going to stop for 50 years, and be like, okay, like the first 60 years right here from 1960 and 2020, that was really fun. We printed all of this money. As a species, we never decide, okay, well, let's go through 60 years of misery, because that's what it would be. Let's go for 60 years of misery and actually pay the money stock off. Right? This is never decided. This has never been decided. And this is how currencies fall and die, because this is never decided by the people. You could fix it if all of a sudden, right, all of the increase in debt here, if we decided to pay it off over 60 years, you could potentially fix this, right? But we're not going to decide that. There's just no way. So the money stock just balloons, and the money stock is condemned to balloon in perpetuity. That's why we say things like QE to infinity, right? So, and you may say, oh, that's not true. The Fed has kept tightening. Well, first of all, we've had 1 year, what is it? About 1 year, maybe 1 year and a half, if you count from November of 2021. We've had 1 year to 1 year and a half of absolute misery. And look the dent. There's been barely any dent. Like at this rate, from, the money that was printed in early 2020 to today, like at this rate, it's going to take us 10 years to go back to early 2020 levels. That's not going to happen. And what happens? We see what's happening right now in the economy. Well, the government works slow, so we don't really see it in the government because the government hasn't really reacted yet. They're still hoping they're going to get a good tax season. But we're going to see the government budget. First of all, one thing that I can predict to you is that maybe next year, I think this year, this budget, the debt, the amount paid towards the debt by U.S. government is going to double. And if this goes for 1 more year, the U.S. government's number one expense in front of Social Security will be debt, will be paying off the debt. That will be the number one expense. And eventually this keeps going for like 3 years, 4 years. Then you'll have all of the money collected in taxes by the government that will go to pay debt. Because the government has to refinance at these crazy interest rates, and the government has borrowed $32 trillion. So, that's point number one. Point number two, companies. Why are there so many layoffs right now? Because the economy is slowing down, because so many companies have so much debt that they have to lay off people. And oftentimes it's legacy companies. There's so much debt, and so they have to lay off people to be able to make those debt payments. I'm simplifying things. But another thing is there's plenty of aspects that go into it. People spend way less money out there because the wealth effect is down, right? And people feel less wealthy, and they're less likely to go out. Companies are very, very, very careful because they're seeing that they can't get the debt that they were planning to get. There's less investments. Companies just don't invest anymore because the cost of capital is so high now. So they're like, okay, we're not going to invest. We're going to be very, very conservative. And you have a lot of frivolous enterprises or products or businesses that are really misallocation of capital or malinvestment that stops happening. So as the Fed is raising rates, we're becoming, a much more virtuous money. And what happens when you do that is that a lot of the slack in the economy, a lot of the things that shouldn't have been in the economy, just goes away and gets wiped out. And so that's why we're going to see more and more layoffs. So many more layoffs are going to happen. And then as you have layoffs, as the economy gets bad, then households will start doing the same thing as companies, and they will stop spending. They'll make less money. Anyways, this is a death spiral. This is what this is. This is a death spiral where it just spirals down all the way to the economy, and the economy starts slowly crashing if they keep going. That's why we are not going to do that. We're not going to do that. And why is the economy going to crash? Right? Because you're reducing the money stock. So all of the prices go down. Everything goes down, right? And when you have the average family that gets started in life buys a house with 5% down, you got 20 to 1 leverage on that house. What's the leverage of someone with a student loan? That's 1,000 to 1, right? I mean, it's everybody's so leveraged. So you are triggering a tremendous deleveraging as you do that. And that's why, the Fed is bluffing. I believe the Fed is strongly bluffing. But here's another reason why it's not going to stop. Because the Fed controls U.S. money supply and counts U.S. money supply at U.S. financial institutions. But there is something much bigger than that. And it is called the euro-dollar market. So, monetary inflation is way worse than M2. It's not just M2, right? It's M2 plus eurodollars, which is an artifact that we owe to Bretton Woods. The eurodollar system is dollars that are housed outside of the US financial system. It's a very shadowy system. And we don't know much about it. We don't know how much hidden dollars there are out there. But this is a video I made a few months ago, and this is kind of my estimate, and this is why I estimated that to be at 15% going forward. Looking at the few papers, very tough to find the papers that have been published that actually discuss how many eurodollars there are out there. There's the US money stock, and kudos to the Fed for being very transparent and publishing M2. I think that's absolutely wonderful. There's not just bad things about that. It's very wonderful that they publish all of this stuff. Eurodollar is so hidden. We really have no idea how much debt is out there, how much debt is being swapped and printed, and how much debt is these banks creating. And what's important to understand is that eurodollar is, even though they're created abroad, they sip back into the US, right? There's a leakage. There's a huge leakage. We live in an international economy, so there's huge leakage between both systems. So even if the Fed right now is stopping monetary growth, you can't know what's going on in the eurodollar market. In the eurodollar market, I would bet the eurodollar market has not stopped and keeps printing and printing and printing. And I was in shock. I retweeted this the other day when I saw the BIS. This is the BIS, right? The Bureau of International Settlement. So that's a solid source that deals with that. That showed that there was $65 trillion in hidden debt in 2022. $65 trillion. Like, I am way off. In my calculation here because I was estimating it to be at about 40 trillion, right? About 40, 35 to 40 trillion in addition to M2 is what I thought there was. 65 trillion. What is, I mean, how many dollars are there out there? We don't know, but there's a lot of them out there. That's why we have this inflation, So we care about how many dollars are out there. That's monetary inflation. That's what we care about the most. And what is the CPI? Well, the CPI, meaning, I mean, it's a little meaningful, like in the medium term, because it's gonna help the Fed, and the Fed makes decisions on the CPI. So short term, I guess it's a little meaningful, but intellectually, the CPI is entirely irrelevant. And if you think about this from a first principles, it's entirely irrelevant, right? What matters is this. What matters is the denominator. What matters is your supply. Let me go back to my division right here. What matters is your supply. It's how many. It's the demand of U.S. dollars, right? What matters is that the number of new U.S. dollars demand grows not as fast as the supply of goods. And because we've had such a great economy, we've been able to keep flat and keep CPI, fairly flat, because you're like, oh, economy gets more productive. So because economy gets more productive, you get to print more dollars to catch up and to kind of balance this out, right? But that's not true. That's not the truth. The truth is that the CPI is what? It's just a biased. It's very biased. It's a biased basket of goods selected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to represent cost of living. It applies to nobody. There is nobody that has exactly this spending pattern. Inflation is a vector. Why do I say it's a vector? Because we're all different. We all have different ages, different interests. And thus, inflation is going to be very, very different from all of us. But inflation is consumer CPI, right? That's what I mean now by inflation. CPC, it's working. They're really doing a good job at redefining what inflation is. Consumer price index applies to very, very few people. First of all, if I ask you, what is the American dream, right? Forget American dream. What is the dream of most people, most families? Owning their home, owning your own house is a goal, is a fundamental goal. Shelter, Maslow's pyramid of needs. That's like the most fundamental thing, right? And they use rent. The CPI uses rent. 32% of the CPI is rent. Now, if you live in a big city, you probably know full well that the cost of real estate is absolutely prohibitive, absolutely insane, and has been growing much, 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 much faster than the cost of rent. So the CPI assumes that you don't have, as part of your life plan or as part of your life goal, you don't have any intention of buying a house. It also assumes, by the way, that you don't have any intention of buying very high quality stock. Like, you don't have any intention of owning the best companies out there. It doesn't assume that, right? The CPI only looks at consumer spending, And we know today that actually a lot of consumers, especially younger consumers, spend money on stocks. They love stocks. They want to buy nice stocks. They want to invest for their future. They want to buy real estate. CPI doesn't take into account of that. But it's even worse. There's a lot of stories about food. Like, there's a tremendous amount of not very good food in the CPI that is included in how they compute food. Like, one of the famous one is, you had steak for the longest time in the food index, and they replaced steak with ground beef. That's a famous example of the little shenanigans they've done with the CPI. Another example is you will do hedonic adjustments. You'll say, oh, the food is better today, and so we need to adjust the prices down, right? But let me go on. There's more. I could go through each of these, right? Energy. What happens if you live in I don't know. You live in Texas, weather's really nice, and you drive an electric car. Well, that's not going to be 7% of your yearly income. Energy. That's going to be way less than that, right? But how about medical services? What if you want the best care for your health? Maybe you're going to spend more than that, right? And let me go even worse. Okay, this is the one that even kind of makes me crazy. Is apparel. 2.6% of income. Alcohol, 1% of income. I guarantee you that I don't spend 1% of my income on alcohol. It's way, way less. And I guarantee you, too, that I don't spend 2.7% on clothing. It's way, 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 way less. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that you assume that every single American is going to spend 1% of their income on alcohol. That makes sense what I'm saying. How about education? The way they put education here. Some people, depending on the stage of their life, they may spend much more on education or much more on medical services. This makes very, very little sense to me. Let me tell you what makes sense. And before I do, let me just show you this, which is the biggest scam, I think, of the CPI, is the cost of primary residence, right? Buying your primary residence. That's right here, the Case-Shiller index. As the denominator of the cost of primary rent. And what does this show? This shows that really it's much cheaper to rent than it is to buy. And it keeps getting cheaper to rent and cheaper to rent than it is to buy. So imagine in the CPI, if they had put, instead of 33%, instead of putting owner's equivalent rent, which we see keeps going down over the past 10 years because of money printing, imagine if they had put owning a house in a safe neighborhood, something as simple as that. I own a house in the safe neighborhood with a decent school district in my town. Imagine what would have happened to the CPI. We would have had 15% inflation, no doubt, if they had replaced rent with, say, a decent family house in a neighborhood. And this is a good transition to what I'm saying here. What matters is how much money is in circulation for people to spend, which we don't know because of the eurodollar market. We don't know how many there are out there, but we know it's growing, and we know it's growing really fast thanks to the Fed, and I'm thankful for the Fed for publishing M2. M2's right here. Thankful for the Fed for publishing that. What matters is how much money is in circulation for people to spend. The more money there is, the more demand there is for stuff, because money sticks. Money will always stick to stuff, and it will particularly stick to the hardest assets. And you see it in your daily life, If you go to a store, you're willing to pay more money, to give up more money for the more quality products. There's a reason, quality stuff costs more. So money will stick much more, say, for example, to reuse my silly example of steak and ground beef. Where do you think money sticks? Do you think money sticks to ground beef? Or do you think money sticks to the USDA prime 28-day aged steak sold at Whole Foods? Yeah, money sticks to the high-end product. Money sticks to fine food. Money sticks to fine houses, right? To great medical services, to great education. This is what money sticks to. Money doesn't stick to things that can be created quickly through scale, through manufacturing scale, right? Money doesn't stick to that. Money sticks to the hard assets, to the things that are finer in life. So money sticks to great real estate. It sticks to great stocks, to great products, to great education, great healthcare, great art, fine foods. Money doesn't stick to fast food. It doesn't stick to junk food, Been living in the US for 12 years. Fast food is just as cheap today as it used to be back then, right? And rare and desirable things of all kinds. That's what money sticks to. That's why real estate is going up. That's why the best assets are going up. That's why bonds are going down. That's why there's a lot of things that money doesn't stick to. And so items with a huge supply, such as those in the CPI, can be produced really quickly and really fast and keep up with how much we print, which is why prices don't appear to go up that much. But what do we have? We have cheap furniture. IKEA furniture, for example, very cheap. We have cheap food. We have cheap beer. Think about all the products out there that are in the CPI that are not very high quality, right? So anyway, I hope I made a conclusion. I hope I kind of made a case that really what matters is how much money is out there and what's your share of that money. That's what matters the most to inflation. And so this is why the channel is called Beat the Denominator. I know macro is not as interesting to a lot of people, but macro is so essential to understand that, all stocks that we love, they're divided by how much money is out there. And we print out so much more money out there than we should, which means that the business we invest in and the high growth businesses that I invest in have to grow their revenue faster than the growth in the money stock. You have to grow your revenue faster than the growth in the money stock. Otherwise, you're just drowning. You're not getting ahead as a company if you don't grow faster than the money stock. That's why, to me, if a company doesn't grow revenue at 15%, at least it's drowning. I want a company to grow revenue at least at 15% to stay flat. And more than that, right? As you know, my minimum threshold for stocks on this channel is 30% revenue growth, because that's the only way we're going to get a decent return, a 15% real terms return. That's a decent return. Anyways, none of this has been investment advice, of course. Lifestyle has no advice of any sort. This is just entertainment. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and have a wonderful day. Thank you.